The morning begins with a stillness that doesn't match the hum of patrol cars gathering along the narrow residential street. Fernvale is used to quiet mist settling over rooftops, cedar branches dripping from the night's rain. But today, the silence feels different. It feels watchful, as if the town itself is holding its breath. Residents peek from behind curtains, their faces half lit by the gray light drifting through the windows. They've seen officers in the neighborhood before, but never this many, never this focused, and never moving with this particular sense of conclusion. Across the street, a modest house stands with its porch light still glowing even though the sun has risen. The light gives the place a worn familiarity, the kind of detail people overlook for years until someone finally points it out. A pair of detectives approach the walkway with measured steps, their jackets dampened by the morning drizzle. The air smells faintly of wet soil and fir needles, the scent carried in from the forest line just beyond the neighborhood. For a moment, nothing happens. Then a door opens. The man who steps out seems startled, though perhaps only by the sudden congregation of attention. He raises a hand out of habit, as though greeting visitors, not understanding why his simple gesture freezes the entire street. His age shows in his slow movements, in the faint stiffness of someone who believes he has lived his life unnoticed. The officers speak to him quietly, and whatever they say causes a flicker of understanding to cross his face. Something old, long buried, shifts inside the moment. Within minutes, he is led down the walkway, the drizzle collecting on the slope of his shoulders. No one cheers. No one yells. The street remains suspended in that muted Oregon morning, carrying only the soft, almost fragile sound of footsteps on damp concrete. A neighbor gasps behind a window pane, piecing together a memory of a man who walked this block for decades, sometimes with a newspaper under his arm, sometimes with nothing but his thoughts. He never seemed dangerous. He never seemed like someone who could hold answers. And yet the officers place him gently into the waiting car. A quiet ripples through Fernvale, one made of disbelief and a strange, unsteady relief. The kind that comes when a truth arrives so late, it feels like a foreign language. People step outside now, cautious, whispering, clutching jackets against the cold air. They look toward Maple Crown Park in the distance, where the trails waned through dark cedar groves, where children once rode bicycles in the warmth of summer without fear. Even now, the park feels like another presence watching from the tree line, as if acknowledging what is finally unfolding. Detective Mara Ellison stays behind after the patrol cars pull away. She stands near the curb, letting the mist gather around her, studying the house where the man lived for so many years. Her mind drifts to the evidence room, to the newly opened archive boxes, to the fragile envelope that changed everything. She had known the moment she found it that the case would move again. That time, no matter how heavy, had not sealed every door. And now that the suspect has been identified and detained, the weight she has carried through countless cold case files feels lighter, though not gone. Not yet. She walks down the street toward her car, passing the houses where people watch with that delicate blend of fear and curiosity. Many of them lived here during the summer Lena Harrow went missing. Some helped search the trails, some prayed, some tried to forget. They all remember the bicycle found near the bend in the park, the one detail that never faded even as years pressed forward. For a long time, the town learned to live with the memory like a bruise that never fully healed. As Mara reaches her car door, she pauses. The forest in the distance is blanketed in a soft morning haze, the sort that swallows details and softens shapes. She can almost imagine a single figure riding along one of the trails decades earlier, a young girl counting her miles, completely unaware of the shadow following her. That image has haunted the file for 31 years, and it flickers now in her mind with a new sharpness, not a mystery, but a story on the brink of resolution. Some moments in investigations arrive with explosive clarity. Others arrive like this one quiet slow, unfolding through mist. But each holds the same truth. Answers surface in their own time, and when they do, they reshape everything left in their wake. To understand how this began, we go back to 1987. Before the case became a fixture in Fernvale's memory, before her name was repeated in soft, careful tones, Lena Harrow was simply a girl moving through her world with a kind of earnest momentum. She lived in a small house at the end of Alder Row, a home warmed by the smell of coffee in the mornings and the sound of her mother folding laundry in the living room. The walls of her bedroom were lined with racing posters and faded newspaper clippings of regional cycling events. She had collected them not out of pride, but out of a sense of direction, as if each article sketched a possible future she wanted to step into. Lena's mornings were always early. She liked how the town looked before most people were awake, when the streets were quiet and the dew still clung to the blades of grass along the sidewalks. Her father often woke around the same time, shuffling into the kitchen with heavy footsteps before settling at the table with a mug in his hands. He rarely said much in the mornings, but he always smiled when Lena walked in with her hair tied back and her helmet dangling from 2 fingers. He called her the little metronome because she kept such precise times for her practice rides, marking down her miles and speed with the precision of someone far older. She kept her training log under her pillow at night, not because it was secret, but because it felt important. Each entry was a small step toward the summer race she hoped to compete in, a race she talked about with the mix of nerves and determination only a teenager could hold. Her mother read the log sometimes, tracing a finger over the careful handwriting before placing it back as if it were made of something delicate. At school, Lena was known for her steadiness. She wasn't the loudest nor the quietest, but she had a clarity about her that people recognized. Teachers trusted her with responsibilities. Classmates relied on her for group projects. She volunteered to help organize equipment in the gym, and she sometimes stayed after class to help a friend go over math problems. She didn't excel at everything, but she tried, and that effort was its own kind of brightness. What stood out most about her was how she moved light, quick, almost electric. Friends said they could always hear the soft whirring of her bike wheels before they saw her face. She loved the feeling of speed, the sense of the ground passing beneath her as if she were riding on a thin seam of wind. She often took the long route home just to enjoy the descent near Miller's Ridge, the one stretch of road in Fernvale that offered a moment of pure, clean momentum. Her bicycle was the object she cared for most. A simple model with a scratched blue frame. It was nothing like the sleek racing bikes she admired in magazines, but she treated it like a companion. She wiped down the chain after rainy rides, checked tire pressure before heading out, and adjusted the seat with a care that mirrored how some kids handled musical instruments. Whenever she rode past Maple Crown Park, she would glance at the forest trails branching off into the deep greens of the fir trees. Those trails fascinated her, not only because they were quiet and scenic, but because they felt like pathways into something larger than the town itself. Her parents trusted her in a way that came from years of seeing her judgment and responsibility. They watched her grow into her habits, the way she lined up her shoes by the door, the way she arranged her notebooks in color-coded stacks, the way she came home on time unless she warned them otherwise. Trust was natural in their home, and Lena carried it gently, like something she didn't want to break. On weekends, she helped her mother with small tasks around the house. She liked sweeping the porch, partly because it let her look out at the neighborhood, partly because she enjoyed the feeling of clearing away what the wind had brought in. Sometimes she helped her father wash the car, laughing when water splashed onto her shoes. Afterwards, the family would sit together for simple meals, talking about the week or the weather or nothing at all. Their home wasn't extraordinary, but there was a rhythm to it, a warmth that made it easy to imagine the future without realizing how fragile that imagining could be. One of Lena's closest friends, Maren, lived 2 blocks away. They often rode bikes together, though Lena always waited patiently when Maren had to slow down on hills. They spent afternoons sprawled on the grass near the schoolyard, talking about everything they believed adulthood would bring. Lena always talked about racing, maybe coaching younger cyclists, maybe working in a sporting shop, maybe something else entirely, but the bicycle was always at the center of her dreams. It represented movement, independence, the feeling of directing her own course. There were small rituals in her life, details so ordinary they would later become haunting. She tied her shoelaces twice before every ride. She wore the same hair tie, a fading purple elastic she refused to replace. She kept her favorite socks aside for long-distance days. And she always tapped the left handlebar twice before pushing off, a habit she never explained, not even to herself. In the evenings, she would sit on the small bench on the back porch, writing quick notes in her training log as the sounds of the forest drifted in, distant birds, rustling branches, the gradual settling of the day. Her mother sometimes watched her from the kitchen doorway, admiring how fully Lena inhabited her world, how easy it was to picture her growing into the person she wanted to become. The day before she disappeared, everything felt ordinary. Lena woke early, as usual, grabbed a piece of toast, and told her mother she planned to ride a longer route the next day, since the weather forecast promised clear skies. Her father checked the tires on her bike that evening, tightening the front brake cable and reminding her to watch for slick patches near the trail entrance. Lena smiled, promised she would, and then wrote a short entry in her log. Maybe the long loop. If time feels right. Her last phone call was to Marin around dinner time. They talked about homework, about a substitute teacher they didn't quite trust, about the upcoming summer race. Marin remembered Lena sounding excited, full of that quiet energy she always had before a new challenge. They said goodnight without thinking much about it. There was nothing unusual, nothing ominous, nothing that hinted at how close they stood to the edge of a story they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand. That night, Lena laid her bike helmet beside her bed and set her training log under her pillow. The house settled into silence, the kind that only deepens in small towns where nights arrive quickly, and the forest holds the darkness a little longer than it should. She drifted to sleep thinking about the trail, the upcoming race, and the hum of her wheels against the ground, simple things that made her feel steady, focused, and free. By morning, she would be gone, and everything ordinary in her life would become a memory held too tightly by those who loved her. The morning of August 14, 1987 began without distinction. A light marine layer hung over Fernvale, carrying the smell of wet bark and the faint promise of heat later in the afternoon. By 6:30, the Harrow home was already stirring. Lena woke before her alarm, stretching with the same quiet anticipation she carried before every long-distance ride. She checked her training log, glanced at the circled date, and dressed with a precision that matched her habits. Outside, the neighborhood was still, guarded by the pale haze drifting between rooftops. Her father tightened the brake cable once more, testing the give of the lever with his thumb. Her mother handed her a granola bar and reminded her to keep to the main loop if the trails were too muddy from the night's drizzle. Lena nodded, fastened her helmet, and tapped the left handlebar twice. The gesture meant nothing to anyone else, but she always did it before pushing off. It was the last familiar sound her parents heard before she pedaled down Alder Row and vanished around the corner. At 6:47 a.m., she passed the old post office, counting her breaths and settling into her usual rhythm. The air felt crisp against her skin. A neighbor walking his dog waved. She waved back without slowing. By 6:52, she was near the elementary school, where the dew still clung to the chain-link fences. She turned left toward Miller's Ridge, coasting down the gentle slope she loved. Her wheels hummed against the pavement, steady, controlled, certain carrying her toward Maple Crown Park. At 7:03, she reached the trailhead. Her odometer clicked quietly as she shifted gears and stepped onto the softer earth. The forest absorbed sound with the ease of something ancient. Moisture hung in the air, settling onto Lena's arms as she followed the trail deeper into the park. She knew the route well, the first gradual incline, the split near the old cedar, the brief opening where morning light filtered through. She planned to take the long loop, the one she reserved for days when she felt strong. At 7:11, a jogger coming up the opposite direction noticed her, the bright blue bike frame easy to spot even through the fir branches. They exchanged a brief hello. It would be the last confirmed sighting. Past that point, the forest seemed to close in around her. The morning haze thickened, resting low to the ground. Lena pushed uphill through a patch of soft soil, gripping the handlebars with practiced stability. A squirrel darted across her path. She steered slightly right, weaving around a fallen branch still slick with moisture. She was alone, but the solitude didn't bother her. She'd always found comfort in the quiet spaces of the park. What happened next would never be fully reconstructed. Investigators later mapped her likely trajectory. She would have reached the trail bend around 7:16. The bend, partially hidden by undergrowth, offered a brief blind spot from all directions. Soil samples taken years later suggested she slowed there, perhaps shifting weight to adjust her balance. For a moment, everything must have seemed normal. The path turned gently. Light filtered through the treetops. The hum of her wheels softened. Then the timeline fractured. By 7:20, she should have reappeared on the other side of the bend, crossing the small footbridge near the creek. But a pair of early hikers, resting by the water, never saw her. They heard nothing but the low murmur of the creek and the shuffle of their own backpacks. The trail was empty. At 7:35, Lena's absence became a thin thread tugging at the edges of probability. She wasn't due home for another hour and a half, so no alarm was raised. The forest carried on with its own rhythm, indifferent to the small break in pattern. It wasn't until 10:18 that her mother began to worry. Lena always returned by mid-morning unless she planned otherwise. Her father drove through Fernvale, checking the usual routes. By noon, the family contacted their neighbor, then the local sheriff's office. Officers arrived at the Harrow home at 12:47 and headed straight to Maple Crown Park. Search efforts began almost immediately. Volunteers streamed in, some carrying flashlights, even though it was still daylight, others whispering that maybe she'd taken a longer loop than expected. The first sweep of the main trail revealed nothing. Searchers moved deeper into the woods, calling her name into the damp air. The forest swallowed the sound. At 1:16 p.m., a teenage boy who often rode the trails found the first significant clue. He had taken a shortcut off the main path, veering down a slope where the ground softened into a narrow ravine. Halfway down, he saw the glint of metal. Lena's bicycle lay on its side near the bend. The front wheel spun slightly in the soft breeze. The right handlebar grip was scuffed, bearing a fresh abrasion. The chain had slipped from the gears, hanging loose, dusted with damp soil. Her water bottle was still clipped in place. The bike showed no sign of collision with a tree or fall severe enough to explain the scene. The boy froze, knowing instinctively that the discovery meant more than a forgotten ride. He called out to the nearest group of searchers. Within minutes, officers arrived, marking off the area and taking note of every small disturbance in the soil. The air around the bicycle felt unnaturally still, as if the forest itself were holding something back. At 2:04, a search dog alerted near a patch of dense underbrush about 30 yards from the bike. The alert was weak, inconsistent, easily lost in the shifting air currents. The area was thick with ferns and cedar roots. Volunteers combed through the undergrowth, but found nothing definitive. The soil was soft, but no clear footprints had survived the morning moisture. Investigators documented the site meticulously. They took soil samples, photographed the bike from multiple angles, and used measuring tapes to map the position of each object relative to the trail. A small indentation in the ground near the rear tire caught attention, shallow, vaguely shaped, and difficult to interpret. It could have been a heel mark. It could have been the imprint of a rock. It was logged anyway. By late afternoon, the search expanded. Officers moved in grid patterns, calling her name with increasing urgency. Helicopters scanned the area from above, though the tree cover limited visibility. Volunteers pushed into side trails, some rarely used, hoping for any sign. The forest held its secrets tightly. At 5:37 p.m., one of the search teams reached a clearing near the creek. A series of disturbed leaves suggested someone had moved through recently. Kneeling, an officer brushed aside a layer of damp foliage and found a faint smear on a piece of bark, too faint to identify immediately, too critical to ignore. It was collected for analysis, though the technology of 1987 would offer few answers. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped. Mist settled into the ravine, blurring the edges of branches and stones. Flashlights bobbed in the dimming light. Someone found a torn thread caught on a low branch, dark blue in tone, possibly from clothing. It was logged, bagged, and carried out. A nearby area showed signs of compressed soil, as though someone had knelt or leaned heavily there, but the impression was too vague to map clearly. The forest seemed aware of the commotion, absorbing the sounds of footsteps and voices until the noises felt muted, distant. What investigators sensed most strongly was the absence, the haunting quiet where they expected evidence of a struggle, a cry, a discarded item. The scene felt suspended, as if the crucial moment had occurred just beyond their reach. As night approached, the search was paused. Officers noted every detail, every uncertainty, every disturbance in the foliage. They returned to the trail bend repeatedly, unable to shake the feeling that they were missing something subtle. One detail lingered in the reports: a single, almost invisible scrape on the bark of a cedar trunk facing the trail. It was small, no wider than a fingernail, and positioned at a height consistent with someone gripping the tree briefly. Some believed it was incidental, caused by a passerby days earlier. Others wondered if it marked the moment Lena encountered someone, or braced herself, or tried to pull away. The scrape was photographed, measured, and entered into the record. But no one could explain it. And in the deep quiet of Maple Crown Park, the unanswered question settled into the air, waiting for a truth that would take decades to surface. In the days after Lena's disappearance, the investigation surged forward with the kind of urgency that pulls a small town into a single shared breath. Officers worked 12-hour shifts, volunteers combed through the brush with sticks and flashlights, and the sheriff's office became a place where strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, offering tips that blurred together in the rush. But urgency has a short lifespan, and as days turned into weeks, the investigation began absorbing a different kind of weight. The first suspect emerged almost immediately. A groundskeeper from the park had been seen near the trail that morning, carrying pruning shears and moving equipment. He had a history of trespassing violations in another county, though nothing violent. Officers interviewed him for hours, asking about his route, his timing, his movements near the bend. He insisted he had been trimming branches near the north entrance, nowhere near where Lena vanished. His alibi was thin and his demeanor uneven, so detectives pressed harder. But a fellow worker eventually confirmed he'd been with him most of the morning. With no evidence linking him to the bicycle or the disturbed underbrush, he was released. Rumors still clung to his name long after, but the case moved on without him. A second lead arrived through a breathless phone call from a woman who claimed she saw a teenage girl matching Lena's description getting into a blue pickup at a gas station outside town. The sheriff's office tracked down every registered blue pickup in Redwood Crest County, conducting interviews that stretched into late nights and frayed tempers. One man admitted to being in the area that morning, said he had stopped for fuel but had never seen a cyclist. Another driver had sold his truck months earlier and insisted he had no memory of the day in question. Despite the frenzy of effort, the witness couldn't definitively identify anyone. Her story shifted slightly each time she repeated it, as memory stretched thin over the pressure to be useful. Eventually, the lead dissolved. By the second week, the strain started to show. In the Harrow home, hope and dread circled each other without settling. Lena's mother kept the porch light on at night, opening the curtains every hour just to look out at the street. Her father walked to the park each morning, scanning trails as if expecting to find something everyone else missed. When officers updated them, they often spoke gently but with an exhaustion they tried to hide. Every answer was wrapped in the same careful phrasing. "We're still looking. We're following every lead. We haven't given up." The first press conference drew an unexpected crowd. Reporters asked questions that left detectives tight-jawed. One asked if Lena might have run away. Another wondered aloud if the family was withholding information. The sheriff firmly rejected both ideas, but doubt had already slipped into the spaces between statements. After the conference, a deputy muttered, "They're going to twist every word we say," and the sheriff, rubbing the bridge of his nose, replied, "Then we'll say less." As summer shifted into early fall, the investigation expanded into what the office called a multi-layered review. Old case files from nearby counties were examined for similarities. One case, involving an attempted assault in a park 2 towns over, captured their attention. The victim had fought off the attacker and described a man in his 20s with a scar near his jaw. That description didn't match anyone in Fernvale, but still, detectives wondered if the cases could be linked. They visited the victim, reviewed composite sketches, and cross-referenced the incident with known offenders in the region. Nothing matched. The parallel case drifted into the background, but never fully left their minds, creating a faint echo that muddled theories for years. Then came the tip about a drifter seen camping near the creek the week Lena disappeared. Officers located him in a nearby town, living out of a damaged trailer behind an abandoned warehouse. He agreed to talk, though his nervous energy made his interview difficult. He admitted to being in the park several times that summer, spoke vaguely about collecting scrap metal and fishing near the creek. When asked if he had seen Lena, he shook his head but couldn't recall specific dates. His inconsistencies raised suspicion, and he was held overnight. But no physical evidence connected him to the bicycle or the trail. He insisted he had nothing to do with the missing girl. Eventually, he too was released, though investigators kept his file on hand for years. The emotional toll on the investigators wore deeper with time. Deputies who had once treated the Harrow case as their top priority found themselves pulled into other responsibilities. The sheriff grew quieter, aware that every passing week made recovery less likely. At meetings, detectives went over old notes until they were worn at the edges, hoping a fresh detail would stand out. But the case was like a pattern woven into a cloth that kept tightening no matter how much they pulled at the thread. In November, a hunter reported finding what he believed might be human remains near a ravine on the far side of the park. The sheriff's office mobilized quickly, only to discover that the bones belonged to a deer. The false alarm shook everyone more than they expected. Even the Harrow family responded with a mixture of relief and despair, the emotional swing reminding them how fragile their hope had grown. A few weeks later, a man from a nearby town walked into the station claiming he had information. He said he overheard 2 people talking about a girl who went missing in the woods, though he couldn't provide names or specific details. The tip felt fabricated, almost performative, but officers followed protocol. The lead went nowhere. It joined dozens of others in the growing stack of dead ends. Winter brought a heavy stillness. Snow fell over Fernvale in early December, covering the trails and erasing what remained of the subtle markers investigators hoped to re-examine. The bicycle was already logged and stored, its image imprinted in every officer's mind. The scuffed handlebar grip offered no clear story. The scraped cedar trunk was analyzed, photographed, debated, and ultimately classified as inconclusive. Soil samples revealed nothing definitive. The faint smear on the tree bark near the creek was too degraded for biological analysis at the time. Every piece of evidence held potential but refused to offer resolution. By the 1-year mark, the investigation had lost its momentum. Detectives privately agreed that they were no closer to the truth than they had been the day the bicycle was found. The sheriff began referring to the case as ongoing but inactive, a phrase that felt like a small defeat each time it was spoken. The Harrow family continued to meet with investigators, though the tone shifted. The early phase of frantic action had transformed into a quieter, more brittle exchange. Her mother often asked the same question, "Did you find anything new?" And the answers, increasingly repetitive, settled over the room like dust. Her father's visits grew shorter. He spoke less, listened more, and began carrying Lena's training log with him as if it held a code he hadn't yet deciphered. Years passed, and the case evolved into something students studied in criminal justice programs. Newspaper archives held it as a sad landmark in the town's history. Officers transferred, retired, or left law enforcement altogether, passing down notes and memories to new detectives who tried to pick up where others left off. The case moved through reorganizations, shifting from one storage room to another until boxes were mislabeled or misplaced, each transfer adding another layer of difficulty. One interview from the original investigation contained a single line that should have stood out. A man named Evan Rourke had been briefly questioned because he lived near the park. His name appeared in one of the old handwritten lists but was mistakenly filed under park regulars instead of interviewed adults. When the records were digitized years later, that category was deprioritized and left for later processing. No one noticed the oversight. Rourke slipped out of the investigative frame without anyone intending it. In community gatherings, Lena's name continued to be spoken with respect, but also with an unspoken resignation. New families moved into the houses along Alder Row, unaware of the history that lingered in the trails beyond. The forest grew thicker around the trail bend, ferns spreading across the ground where searchers once combed for signs. By the late 1990s, the case file was closed to active investigation. It remained accessible for review, but required formal requests to reopen. The sheriff signed the final administrative note himself, stating that the department lacked new leads or evidence to proceed. It was a practical decision, but one that felt, to those who remembered the early days, like a curtain falling. In the Harrow home, Lena's room remained largely unchanged. Her mother dusted the shelves once a week, straightened the posters, and opened the windows on warm days. Her father kept the training log in a drawer beside his bed. Neither spoke much about January 12th, the day they received the official notice that the case was moving to cold storage. They sat at the kitchen table for a long time that evening, the quiet between them heavier than anything the Forest Service could measure in humidity. The file was boxed, labeled, and shelved among other unresolved cases. It waited in the dim light of the evidence archive, its pages holding questions no one yet had the tools to answer. And in the deep quiet of Maple Crown Park, the unanswered moment remained an impression in the soil, a scrape on the cedar, details noted but left without explanation. The door to the case wasn't officially closed, but in the minds of many who had once chased its answers, it might as well have been. Time has a way of softening edges that once felt sharp, of turning urgency into memory, and memory into something that lives quietly in the spaces people rarely speak about. In Fernvale, as the first years after Lena's disappearance passed, the case did not vanish so much as it slipped into the background hum of life. Yet for the Harrow family, the weight never eased, only changed shape. In the early 90s, the neighborhood around Alder Row looked much the same. The same wooden fences, the same cracked sidewalks, but inside the Harrow home, time moved differently. Lena's mother, Elise, began keeping her daughter's room as it had been, dusting it each Saturday morning. She straightened the race posters, smoothed the edges of the bedsheets, and placed the training log at the center of the desk, open to the last entry. Each week, the room grew a little quieter, as though waiting for footsteps that never returned. Lena's father, Mark, dealt with the years in a different rhythm. He became quieter, more private. He took long walks through town at dusk, following the streets Lena used to ride. Sometimes he stopped near the trail entrance of Maple Crown Park, listening to the slow movement of wind through the cedars, imagining that if he stood still enough, some trace of her might drift back to him. He often carried her training log in his jacket pocket, running his thumb over the words she had written in her careful handwriting. He never said why he carried it. He didn't have to. As the calendar turned through the 90s, Seasons arrived and left with a familiar regularity. Friends of the Harrow family continued to visit, though the visits grew shorter, the conversations more careful. Over time, people learned to tiptoe around Lena's name, not out of avoidance, but out of respect. The weight of it had become delicate, something handled with quiet hands. Photographs in the living room began to show their age. Colors faded, edges curled. The image of Lena standing beside her bicycle, a snapshot taken just weeks before she disappeared, became the centerpiece of those frames. The picture guests lingered on without meaning to. Elise sometimes caught herself staring at it, not because she wanted pain, but because looking at her daughter's face felt like a way to hold onto a world that had slipped away. Every now and then, a letter arrived. Some were from strangers in other states who had seen the case mentioned in a missing children newsletter. Others came from people who had visited Fernvale and remembered the posters taped to storefront windows decades earlier. These letters became small markers of connection, brief reminders that Lena's story had not been entirely forgotten. Elise kept them in a shoebox under her bed. She opened it on anniversaries, birthdays, and on days when the house felt too silent to bear. Mark found comfort in routine. He took up woodworking, shaping small boxes and frames from cedar and spruce. One winter, he made a small wooden stand for Lena's bike helmet. He placed the helmet on it near the fireplace, the faint scratches on its surface catching light in a way that made it seem both fragile and enduring. It was one of the few objects that felt strong enough to stay in the open without breaking them. Journalists visited occasionally. Most were young, eager to cover unsolved cases for regional papers or college assignments. They sat with the Harrow family, taking notes with a mixture of gentleness and distance. Some articles were thoughtful, others felt invasive, but after a while, the stream of inquiries dwindled. As newer cases surfaced, the old ones sank beneath them, part of the cruel arithmetic of passing years. By the early 2000s, Fernvale itself began to change. New families moved in, unaware of the shadow the park trails carried. Children rode their bikes without knowing the story behind the cautionary tone older neighbors used when they warned them not to go too deep into the forest alone. The path where Lena had last been seen grew over with ferns and moss, softening the imprint of the past. Technology changed too. The local sheriff's office transitioned from paper to digital record-keeping. Files were scanned, reorganized, and stored on servers instead of dusty shelves. During one of these transitions, a young deputy named Colin noticed the Harrow case file. He wasn't old enough to remember the original search, but something about the weight of the file caught his attention. He mentioned it to a superior, who shrugged and said, "Nothing new there." It's been cold for years, yet Colin kept thinking about it. He couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the simplicity of the story, a girl, a bicycle, a trail, and then nothing. Perhaps it was the photograph clipped to the top of the file, the one showing Lena smiling in the sun. Or maybe it was the feeling that the case, despite its age, still held something unresolved. A few times he brought the file home after his shift and read through the old reports. He recognized the limitations of the era, the grainy photographs, the imprecise sketches, the early DNA notes that barely scratched the surface of what science would later achieve. But he also noticed something that wasn't mentioned in any summary: the swab labeled Sample B, noted as collected near the creek. It appeared in one log but not in the inventory list. He wondered if it had been misplaced. The idea nagged at him, but without authority to reopen anything, he pushed it aside. Meanwhile, the Harrow family did what families do when time forces them to keep living. They marked birthdays with quiet ritual. They attended gatherings less frequently. They learned to speak in a measured way about their loss, neither clinging too tightly nor letting it dissolve entirely. Their love for Lena did not fade, but it settled into a different kind of presence, something steady, tempered by years. Friends sometimes asked Elise how she managed to carry the weight. She always gave the same answer: "We don't have a choice." But privately, she carried a prayer that one day, Someone with the right tools, the right attention, or simply the right timing would reopen the file and search again. Mark rarely spoke about hope. He preferred actions to words, so he kept maintaining the small wooden helmet stand, polishing it once a month. He kept the porch light bulb changed regularly, even though he no longer left it on each night. And he continued visiting Maple Crown Park, standing near the trail bend as though listening for something buried in the air. As the 2010s approached, a shift occurred quietly in the world of forensic science. Articles appeared about new methods for analyzing degraded samples. Genealogy databases grew. A few major cases around the country were solved not through fresh evidence, but through old evidence re-examined with modern tools. These stories traveled, whispered through law enforcement circles, then filtered through communities who wondered whether their own unanswered tragedies might be next. In 2017, news reached Redwood Crest County about a cold case in another state, solved through forensic genealogy. It sparked conversations in the sheriff's office. Colin, now several years into the job, brought up the Harrow case again. He asked whether old evidence might be resubmitted for new testing. His supervisor was uncertain, but told him to check the archives. The next day, Colin walked into the evidence storage room, a place with dim lighting and rows of metal shelves. Boxes sat in neat columns, each holding fragments of someone's story. He found the Harrow box and pulled it down, feeling its weight settle into his arms. When he opened it, he noticed the contents had shifted slightly over the years. Placed between two larger folders, he saw a paper envelope with an aging label he didn't remember from the scanned records. It was marked Sample B, Creekside. The handwriting was faint but clear. Something inside him stirred. He brought the envelope to the evidence technician, who confirmed it hadn't been logged in decades. Colin stared at the label for a long moment, feeling the quiet pressure of possibility. The town outside had changed, and the years had carved lines into the faces of everyone who remembered this summer of 1987. But the evidence was still here, waiting. And the world finally had the tools to listen to what it held. For the first time in decades, a small thread of hope returned to the Harrow case, not loud, not triumphant, but steady, patient, and real. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The envelope was smaller than anyone expected. Thin, nearly weightless, marked with aging handwriting that slanted gently downward as though the writer had been in a hurry. Most officers would not have noticed it, but when Detective Mara Ellison unfolded the flaps of the Harrow casebox and saw the faded label reading, Sample B, Creekside, she felt a quiet pull of possibility. It seemed strange that something so inconspicuous could have survived decades of reorganizations, relocations, and procedural reshufflings. Yet here it was, a fragment of the past ready to introduce itself again. She carried it to the evidence technician on duty, who looked at the envelope with the cautious respect reserved for delicate things. When they transferred the contents into a sterile container, a small cotton swab slid into view, sealed in an older-style plastic tube. It bore a timestamp from the summer of 1987 and a barely legible signature of the crime scene technician, who had collected it. The tag indicated it came from the Creekside cluster of underbrush, an area that had drawn faint canine alerts during the search, but had never yielded definitive clues. Mara felt the weight of the years pressing against the moment. She knew the limitations of 1980s forensic work. She knew how easily evidence degraded, how often samples like this turned into disappointment. But she also knew that technology had grown sharper, faster, more capable of recovering stories from fragments once deemed too faint to interpret. She submitted the swab for reanalysis with a formal request to the Oregon State Forensic Laboratory. Not an urgent request, but a hopeful one. She carried the container herself, driving in steady rain, watching the mist unravel across the valleys. When she handed the evidence to forensic biologist Dr. Yvonne Keller, the older woman nodded with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen the contours of possibility enough to recognize when one was forming. "This is degraded," Dr. Keller said quietly as she examined the tube. But it might have more to say now than it ever could have then. They began with a gentle extraction method designed for older samples, warming the tube to a precise temperature to coax biological traces loose without damaging them. Under the soft hum of specialized equipment, the swab responded, revealing faint strands of genetic material that older methods would have overlooked. The lab was sterile and bright, a world of precise measurements that made no room for the emotional noise accompanying cases like Lena's. Still, something reverent lingered in the way Dr. Keller moved, as though she understood the human cost behind every degraded fiber. The first pass of amplification produced small fragmented sequences, partial, incomplete, like torn pages from a book. But the second pass, using a high-fidelity enzyme developed specifically for cold case evidence, yielded more. Alleles emerged in patterns, digits aligning into recognizable markers. Mara stood by the doorway, arms folded, listening to the soft cadence of the sequencer as it processed the data. When the machine finally chimed, Dr. Keller leaned in close, studying the displayed results. Her brow tightened slightly, not in disappointment, but in concentration. "We have a partial male profile," she said. "Not a full one. But strong enough meant it could speak to the present." The sample underwent a secondary refinement through a technology the lab called Centurion 12, a system capable of reading degraded DNA dozens of times, consolidating data points into a reliable set of markers. These markers did not deliver a name, but they offered links, distance, ancestry, lines on a tree stretching outward. After 24 hours of processing, a dataset was prepared for genealogical mapping. Using a secure law enforcement portal, the profile was uploaded into a database designed to identify distant relative, fourth cousins, even fifth. The search was slow, branches unfurled across a map of the country. Points of connection bloomed, faded, reconnected. Days passed and the data assembled itself into something the genealogist could read, a network of people distantly tied by blood. The first hit was a woman living in Montana. The second, a retired teacher in Northern California. Several more emerged scattered across states, each holding a sliver of shared ancestry. From those slivers, genealogists began constructing a tree first broad, then narrowing. They sifted through census records, obituaries, property deeds, and digitized directories. Names interlaced, generations aligned. A path began forming. 2 days later, the tree narrowed to a single branch leading toward Redwood Crest County. The genealogist on call, a patient man named Norris, highlighted a short list of possible male descendants born between the mid-1950s and early 1960s. At the top of the list was a name that hadn't surfaced in the case in decades, Evan Rourke. He had lived within walking distance of Maple Crown Park at the time of Lena's disappearance. He had been interviewed briefly, though the questions asked of him were standard, almost perfunctory. His name had been misfiled, lost under a heading that never made the transition into the digitized system. For years, he'd existed as little more than an echo in a paper archive. Mara read the genealogist's summary twice, then a third time. Nothing dramatic happened in the room, no sudden exclamation, no racing heartbeat, just the slow, deliberate arrival of clarity. She printed everything, spread the documents across the table, and understood that for the first time in 31 years, the case was breathing again. But a genealogical match was not enough. They needed contemporary DNA, something that could confirm the connection with absolute certainty. Surveillance began quietly. Rourke, now older, moved through his routines with unremarkable precision. He lived alone, worked part-time maintenance jobs, kept mostly to himself. There was nothing in his outward life that suggested a man hiding a violent history. On the third day of observation, he visited a small cafe near the edge of Fernvale. He lingered by the window, drinking slowly, then discarded his cup in a public trash bin before walking home. Within minutes, the evidence technician retrieved the cup, sealed it, and transported it to the lab. Dr. Keller prepared the sample. The room grew still as she extracted genetic material from the rim of the discarded cup, amplifying it through the same high-fidelity process used on sample B. It was fresh, clear, unbroken, a genetic fingerprint, unobscured by decades. When the results appeared, two profiles sat side by side, the modern, crisp sequence and the degraded but distinct pattern from the swab collected near the creek in 1987. The alignment lit up almost instantly. Same markers, same alleles, same man. Mara exhaled slowly, everything around her balanced in a moment of quiet triumph. Years of silence condensed into a single truth that felt both heavy and radiant. The past had found its way into the present. Word traveled quickly but cautiously. When representatives from the State Cold Case Division informed the Harrow family, the reaction was not loud or sudden. Elise sat quietly, absorbing the words as if they were arriving through layers of fog. Mark held onto the back of a chair, his grip tightening, the room around him blurring into stillness. They didn't cry. Not immediately. They simply let the truth settle, letting it reshape the hollow places time had carved. In Fernvale, the news spread softly. Neighbors spoke in low voices across fences. People who had grown up with the story told their children what had happened long before they were born. The park, once a reminder of fear, felt changed, still solemn, but no longer suspended in unanswered uncertainty. When the arrest was made, the morning was cool and damp, the kind of weather that mirrored the day Lena disappeared. Rourke stepped outside his house without protest, a man who had lived half a lifetime unnoticed. Officers moved with quiet certainty, confining him with a gentleness that did not erase the gravity of what had been uncovered. For the community, the moment was not about spectacle, but about release. A slow, steady breath long held finally exhaled. And in the Harrow home, a single photograph, Lena standing beside her bicycle, seemed to hold more light than before, as though truth, even when arriving late, could still reach back into the darkest corners and illuminate what had been waiting there all along. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. The morning of the arrest began quietly, a gray light stretching across Fernvale as if reluctant to wake the town fully. Officers approached the narrow walkway leading to Evan Rourke's front door with measured steps, their breaths visible in the mild chill. A few neighbors watched through curtains, sensing the tension before understanding its cause. Rourke opened the door slowly, his hand resting on the frame, confusion flickering across his face. He listened as the officers read the charges, his expression shifting into something hollow and subdued. There was no outburst, no attempt to flee. He simply nodded, as though he had been expecting the moment without knowing when it would arrive. As he was led toward the patrol car, the drizzle deepened. Drops gathered on the hood of the vehicle, forming small mirrored circles that trembled before sliding down. Rourke glanced once toward the street, not meeting any eyes, then lowered his head as the door closed behind him. The soft thud was enough to ripple through the cluster of neighbors who had stepped outside. Some whispered. Others stood in stunned stillness, their minds trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the truth unfolding in front of them. The sheriff's office released a brief statement confirming an arrest in the decades-old case. Within hours, television vans and journalists from nearby cities arrived, parking along the narrow roads of Fernvale. Microphones gathered outside the courthouse like a second kind of forest, their metal stems catching the rain. Reporters recited the sparse facts available. An arrest made through modern forensic developments. A suspect living quietly in the same county for years. They spoke in measured tones, aware that this was not just news but the reopening of a wound long held in silence. Inside the courthouse, the air carried a solemn stillness. Wooden benches, polished from years of use, reflected the muted light drifting through high windows. Court clerks moved with practiced efficiency, placing documents on tables, adjusting microphones, and nodding to the attorneys as they entered. The Harrow family arrived quietly, greeted by staff who recognized the depth of the moment without speaking about it. Elise clutched her husband's hand, her steps slow but steady. Mark looked ahead with a fixed intensity, as though bracing himself for a truth he had imagined but never witnessed. When Evan Rourke was brought into the courtroom, a subtle shift rippled through the space. He looked older than his age, his posture slightly hunched. His eyes drifted briefly toward the gallery, where the Harrow family sat. There was no confrontation, no recognition. Only a vacant kind of resignation. The judge entered, and the murmur of the room dissolved instantly. The charges were read aloud, each word landing heavily, each count representing a piece of a story that had taken 31 years to stitch together. The prosecution laid out the foundation of the case in a measured, methodical manner. They spoke of the evidence collected from the forest floor, the cotton swab labeled Sample B, and the advanced DNA, a technology that had brought long-denied clarity. They detailed the genealogical mapping that connected distant relatives across states, gradually narrowing the field to one man whose proximity to the crime had once been overlooked. They described the discarded coffee cup and the precise match it yielded, linking the present to the hidden truth of the past. The defense attempted to challenge the chain of custody, raising questions about how Sample B had been stored for decades. They scrutinized the transitions between evidence rooms, the handwritten labels, the procedural inconsistencies that had surfaced over time. But each attempt dissolved under the weight of modern verification. Lab technicians testified with calm confidence. Dr. Yvonne Keller explained the advanced processes used to recover degraded DNA, her clear explanations illuminating how science could give voice to evidence thought long silent. At one point, a photograph of Lena's bicycle was presented. The image, enlarged for clarity, showed the blue frame lying on its side, the handlebar grip scuffed, the chain slackened. Elise's eyes glistened, her breath trembling. Mark closed his hands tightly in his lap. The courtroom remained still, every person present feeling the gravity of what the photograph represented. Not just an object, but the last known moment of a girl whose life had been cut short. Witness testimonies from the original investigation were replayed in fragments, reconstructed through old interview notes. Former officers recalled the early searches, the false leads, the relentless attempts that had exhausted the department's resources. They described their regret, the sense of incompleteness that followed them into retirement. Their words carried the fatigue of years, the heaviness of knowing that something had slipped through their fingers. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom felt charged with a quiet resolve. The judge called for a recess, and people filtered into hallways where the hum of conversation mixed with the sound of rain tapping against windows. Reporters whispered updates into microphones. Family members from both sides stood in small clusters, speaking carefully, aware that the weight of the moment extended beyond what could be said. As the proceedings resumed, the defense presented its final arguments. They spoke of time, memory, and the imperfections of human recollection. They attempted to cast shadows on the clarity brought by the DNA match. But the evidence held. The science was firm, and the genealogical path was unbroken. Hours later, when the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the room exhaled collectively, as though tension itself needed to step outside for air. The deliberation did not take long. When the jury returned, faces solemn, the room quieted. The foreperson stood, reading the verdict with a steady voice. Guilty on all counts. Rourke blinked once, a small, almost imperceptible flinch, then stared forward. For the Harrow family, the words did not bring triumph. They brought a fragile, long-delayed release. Elise leaned gently against her husband's shoulder. Mark exhaled, eyes closed, gripping her hand. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, the air felt heavier, but also clearer. Reporters gathered, though their questions softened when they saw the Harrow family step onto the steps. A few neighbors from Fernvale had driven into town to witness the verdict. One approached quietly, offering a small nod of support, before stepping back into the crowd. The community's presence was not loud. It was steady, carrying the kind of solidarity that had been absent for years, but now returned with purpose. Detective Mara Ellison stood near the entrance, watching the family embrace as the rain began to lighten. She felt the weight on her chest ease in a way she hadn't expected. Closure was never perfect. It carried the shape of what had been lost, unable to fill it, but able at least to define its edges. She approached the Harrows with care. They thanked her with voices quiet but full of meaning. The gratitude wasn't for solving the case. No one could rewrite the past, but for giving shape to the truth, for lifting the silence that had followed them for so long. Fernvale received the news with a muted sense of relief. Conversations at grocery stores, diners, and workplaces carried a cautious hopefulness. Neighbors recalled the early days of the search, the memorials, the years when the case felt like a shadow cast over their town. Now people spoke of Lena with a bit more lightness, not because her story hurt less, but because it no longer ended in uncertainty. The truth had returned, and in doing so, softened the ache of the unknown. In the Harrow home, the photograph of Lena beside her bicycle remained in its usual place, but it seemed to hold a different presence now, as though the years of unanswered questions had finally stepped aside. Elise placed a fresh flower beside the frame. Mark stood for a long moment, allowing himself to breathe in the quiet room. Justice had arrived, not dramatically, not perfectly, but firmly and undeniably. And in Fernvale, where time had once stalled at a single moment along a forest trail, life began to move again. In the months after the verdict, Fernvale settled into a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by unanswered questions, but by the relief of finally knowing the truth. The forest trails in Maple Crown Park, once approached with a mix of caution and memory, began to feel different. People still moved through them with respect, but the shadow that had lingered for decades no longer felt as heavy. The silence of the trees returned to what it had always been, the ordinary hush of a living forest, not the echo of an unresolved story. For the Harrow family, life did not suddenly brighten, nor did grief fade into something simple. Instead, their sorrow softened into something more breathable. Elise found herself opening the windows of Lena's room more often, letting the morning air drift across the posters and neatly arranged books. The room no longer felt sealed in time. It felt tended to like a quiet garden she could finally walk through without breaking. Mark still carried the training log sometimes, though not every day. He read it with the gentleness of someone revisiting a loved memory rather than searching for hidden meaning. Neighbors who once avoided mentioning Lena's name began to speak of her more openly. They recalled the girl who rode her bike with quick precision, who laughed easily, who measured her dreams in miles. The town's storytellers, the teachers, the older shopkeepers, the people who lingered at diners, wove her memory into conversations without fear of reopening wounds. Her story, once held in painful stillness, became something shared with calm reverence. A small memorial was placed near the trail bend where her bicycle had been found. Not elaborate, not intrusive, just a wooden bench and a plaque carrying her name. Cyclists sometimes left ribbons or small charms tied to the nearby branches. Families paused there during hikes, taking a moment to sit and breathe in the stillness. On certain mornings, when the fog drifted low and the light softened through the fir trees, it seemed as though the place held a quiet understanding of everything it had witnessed. The park staff maintained the area carefully. Ferns trimmed back, pathways cleared, signage updated. It wasn't an attempt to erase the past, but to honor it by ensuring the space remained safe and alive. Children rode their bikes along the outer loop again, their parents watching with a restored sense of trust. Life returned to the trails gently, step by cautious step, until the forest felt less like a memorial and more like a place where the living could breathe freely. Detective Mara Ellison continued her work with the Cold Case Division, but something shifted inside her as well. She carried the Harrow case like a quiet anchor, proof that even the most fragile evidence, even the most misplaced file, could still speak if given the chance. She often returned to the lab where sample B had been processed, not out of necessity, but out of gratitude. Science had done what memory alone could not. It had given the past a clear voice. From time to time, she visited the bench near the trail bend. She sat for a few minutes, not as an investigator, but as someone grateful for the resilience of those who kept searching, even when the trail went cold. She thought about how easily the case could have stayed unsolved, how thin the thread of discovery had been, and how remarkable it was that truth had found its way through decades of silence. Legacy in Fernvale became something shared. It wasn't just about the case, or the verdict, or the man who had lived unnoticed for so long. It was about the steady persistence of people who refused to let absence define a story. It was about a family who carried their love through years of unanswered questions. And it was about how even a simple object, a bicycle, could become a symbol of both loss and return. One afternoon, months after the conviction, a young cyclist placed a new blue ribbon on the bench. The color matched the faded shade of Lena's bike frame. It fluttered softly in the breeze, catching light the way her wheels once had. Its motion was small, but meaningful, a reminder that movement, hope, and memory often travel together in ways the world doesn't fully see. Fernvale did not forget. It simply learned how to carry the story with gentleness. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.